I picked this as the topic of influence to introduce primarily because screening has always been a mystery to me in terms of what a good project looks like. And the real problem is, how do you ensure that when you get down the road on any particular project, it's going to be a rewarding experience, rewarding for the client, rewarding for the team, rewarding for yourself, that this makes something that you want to do again, and it doesn't come unraveled on you. And how do you recognize that early on so you can avoid those things that are not an appropriate ACT project? And I guess I don't know what an appropriate ACT project is, and probably wouldn't know if I stumbled over it, but we can play with it. I just finished a project with the YWCA of the Mid-Peninsula in Palo Alto, which is kind of a stalking horse for asking a lot of these questions. And I'll talk more about that in the various segments as we go down the line. But this was a project that we may or may not should have done. And were there any warning signs in the front end that said that we'd feel this way coming out on the back end? There's a few that I can think of, and the first one was that it was an old application. The application had been, the YWCA had not had an ED for 5 years, having lost the one they had years ago that had been there for 20 years, and they just hired a new one finally. And this application was put in place just before that ED came in, and had not been updated since the ED, who had been there about 9 months now, was in place. So it was an old application, probably not completely bought in, maybe a little out of date, not enough to worry about. Didn't have any current financials, which should have been a danger signal because we didn't know how much trouble they were in financially. And it would be, the initial screening would say, if you got working with an old application, get a new one, get it updated, get it signed off by the current people, make sure everybody's on board. The next thing was that when we had our first meeting, the board was there. There were four board members were there, and the ED were there, and they were very, very supportive, and they were just excited, and they were thrilled that we were going to be there to help them out, and they just couldn't say enough. And even if we'd wanted to, I don't think we could have said no. It was just, it kind of gets to you. And so perhaps the message there is that first meeting is not a kickoff meeting or a planning meeting. It's an interview. They should not have the impression that they have been accepted, which I think they do have from all the projects I've been on. But it's an interview, part of the interviewing process, so that at least you have a chance, if you see some red flags, to either get those resolved or back out or agree that this is not the right kind of a thing for an ACT project, or whatever the outcome happens to be. At least you got a shot at it, rather than getting that roped in feeling. And finally, another read, which we got a positive read on, was that are they flexible and are they accessible and are they willing to participate and be part of the project? Are they going to be working with you and willing to play? And interestingly enough, with the exception of the first one, the Y met those with flying colors. They had good board members, great new ED, were very willing to listen, and we scoped down the project, all those kinds of things. And so coming out of the chute, we were in reasonably solid ground. And I guess the sum total of all that message is look for those things and keep the back door open just in case.
I guess a couple of additional comments. One, to build on your comment about being very clear up front on understanding exactly who the client is. And by that I mean specific individuals. And sometimes the client is management, the executive director generally, and sometimes it's the board, and sometimes it's both. And it's very important to kind of establish that up front. The one situation where I had a project blow up on me early was one in where basically the president of the board was the main instigator in trying to bring ACT in, and really didn't have the buy-in of the ED. And when we started talking to the executive director, that became apparent. And then, very early on in the process, probably about a week in when we were having these discussions, executive director resigned. So that was the end of that project. But it just kind of emphasizes the point of, try to establish up front, who you're working for and who's going to be doing what with the results, and kind of get that all out of the way. the other thing is, once you've kind of established, who the project is for, then you actually need to understand who will be kind of the designated ACT contact, and you need to, again, emphasize that it's ideal to have one rather than, oh, well, you can just talk to, all of our managers, which becomes really muddy. If the project isn't really owned by anyone within the organization, then that also is kind of a red flag. Sometimes in a small organization, that person is the executive director. In large organizations that may have more staff members, it might be owned by, the development director, or might be owned by, the programs people or something, and it's important to know who your kind of day-to-day ACT contact is going to be. One other situation I just came across recently with my current project, which is Women's Initiative for Self-Employment. The project they had originally asked for, which had gone through the ACT screening process. So by the time I received it, it was supposed to be a marketing plan. As I went in through my little exercise of finding out who the client was and what they wanted and everything, it turned out that they had also been, they had just recently been told that they were the recipient of a Taproot Foundation grant as well. And that was also in marketing. And that could be okay if it was clearly delineated, but it became apparent it wasn't, because it was about positioning and messaging, and for them logos as well. But the messaging and positioning part was going to start to impact our project, and they were going to start earlier than we were, when it was kind of obvious we should have gone first, since we were doing more of the strategic planning part of it. So that sounded just really messy. And so it took me a couple of sessions, but I finally convinced the executive director that that was not going to be a very clean ACT project, and not going to be a good experience for the volunteers if they didn't have something that they could own, which is perhaps the most important thing, is to try to carve out a project that the team can really take responsibility for and own. In terms of what is an appropriate project, because of the nature of ACT, it's a volunteer process. There are multiple volunteers. People put in, relatively limited amounts of time per month, and it stretches out over several months usually. Planning projects tend to be more appropriate projects than anything that has to do with implementation. And what you'll find of a lot, and the ACT office is pretty good at screening the really obvious ones out, but you'll have people who ask for marketing plans that are kind of thinly disguised as fundraising plans. And what they really want is for all of these great GSB grads with all of their wonderful, well-heeled friends, to give them money. And if you kind of ask a few more questions, they really want this kind of dialing for dollars type of thing. And that's really not going to be very rewarding for any ACT volunteer. So you want to kind of understand, if it's marketing, is it really marketing? Is it kind of strategic marketing, or is this, how many grant makers can you get me in touch with, or how many well-heeled individual donors can you add to my list of contacts? Anything implementation oriented, like we're not in the business of helping them build websites. I mean, anything like that is pretty much out. So you can pretty much get a sense of that when you're talking to the executive director. Also understand that there are time limitations. So there are projects that are just going to take too much time and therefore are not appropriate for a bunch of ACT volunteers. Generally, there will be some kind of research involved, some kind of information gathering, and that phase in every kind of project. So, for example, if it's market research, what I like to say is it's generally okay for doing kind of, a couple of spot interviews and trying to get a qualitative feel for the market, but, it's unlikely an ACT team is going to be able to do justice to a really quantitative market research project. So that's the other thing to keep in mind.
I was really recently decided that this is a really important issue, and one that I don't think a lot of, I think, at least certainly in the way I have in the past approached leading projects and have observed others as well, I think one that we need to think about how we approach them. And this became particularly apparent to me the other day, or a couple of months ago, when the ACT board was reviewing past projects. And there's a part of the board, a group in the board that does the surveys, of course, well, Rudy used to do that, and Brian's on the committee. But the presentation had to do with, part of the presentation listed several of the projects, there were about 4 or 5, that did very poorly in the ratings. And you could see as they were graphed that these were just outliers. And there were some descriptions as to each of these projects and things that happened poorly with them. The common element, as you looked at this list, was these are projects that we probably shouldn't have been doing in the first place. I was particularly aware of that because one of them was one that I led. And I knew it was going to be on the list. It was a project where the client folded the week before the final presentation. Actually, its parent folded them. And I realized that when I go into the first, when I had gone into the first scoping screening meetings before the team is formed, that my approach had been, how am I going to make this project work? That's the wrong first question. That's the second question. The first question needs to be, should we be doing this project? And I think a lot of people, when you start, you get this list from Laura, and it's got all these interesting looking projects, and there's an organization that you really want to work with, and you want to help make them successful, and you just want to make it work. But if that's the way you start the process, you're liable to miss clues that maybe this isn't going to be a good project. Because the only screening that's done before it comes to us as leaders for those first face-to-face meetings, the only screening that's done is done by paper and by telephone with Laura and Ed Best. And they do a great job of weeding out the obvious stuff. But until you get face-to-face, you can't necessarily find the other things. Now, I don't know, looking back on it, whether I could have figured out that this was a wrong client to be taking on, but I could have asked some different questions. It was a client that was just getting a new executive director. We met with the new executive director. She was really gung-ho. It was trying to help them get data that would help them establish their forward-looking strategy, which was going to be changing from what they'd done in the past. She was all gung-ho. This was going to be stuff that she was going to be using to help make the strategy. We thought, oh, this is wonderful. The board member of the parent organization that was sponsoring it was all gung-ho. Well, their budget for this part of the organization looked great, but the questions we didn't ask were, what is the budget and the financials for the parent organization? We didn't ask to talk to other directors who weren't tied in with this particular subsidiary organization. Our whole approach in this process was, how can we make it work, not should we be doing this project in the first place. So in the future, when I go out to lead projects and go through that first phase, I'm going to be much more cognizant of that question as the first one that I think about. And my frame of reference, my mindset will be different in that process. Once I'm convinced that, yes, we should, then I switch to okay, how do we make this work?